I think that's important is that people think 30 years is a long time or the 40-year life of a plant. So if a plant is designed for 40 years and we look at the worst in a 100-year flood, for instance, or the worst in a 100-year earthquake, we come up with one number. But when you look at the longer span, the once in 10,000 year flood or the once in 10,000 year earthquake, suddenly that changes the picture. And we're not, as a society, we really have a very hard time grasping that low probability events do happen. It's not zero. And Fukushima Daiichi should have taught us that. I mean, the magnitude of the quake and the magnitude of the tsunami both were not a once in 10-year, once in 50-year phenomena, but it happened.
So,
And
Arnie, even if we're talking about a once in a thousand year event, now for one location, for one power plant, that still might not seem like a very high risk. But when you multiply that out by all of the power plants and all of the different locations, does that change things?
yes, it absolutely does. There's 440 nuclear plants in the world right now. And if you believe in what the nuclear renaissance suggests, there could be 2 or 3 thousand in 10 or 20 years. So the probability of an event hasn't changed, but the number of targets that the event could hit has increased dramatically. So the probability of a plant somewhere having an earthquake that disables it, we call that damages the nuclear core, goes up significantly. As a matter of fact, the worst plant in the country, as far as what we call core damage frequency from an earthquake, is just 26 miles north of New York City. It's the Indian Point plants. After the plants were built, they discovered a fault that's a mile or two north of the plant. And if that fault were to create a seismic event, the nuclear core would be damaged.
Uh, are you talking about the Indian Point 3 plant, Arnie?
Yes.
That,
Actually, it's Indian Point 2 and 3 are on the same site.
right. From the new seismic analyses that were conducted, we've now increased the possibility of risk from the area. It increased by 72%. So now it looks like there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of that plant being a problem. And 10,000, for some reason, 1 in 10,000, those odds seem to be the action stage for the NRC, and I don't know why that is. So it's right there on the border as to that plant has the greatest risk in the country. But when we talk about risk, it all has to do with probabilities and statistics. We've used the same idea when we think about flooding. For example, when you look at probability statistics, although the 100-year flood doesn't mean that you're going to have one flood every 100 years. It says there's a small percentage, a 1% chance of that flood occurring in any given year. And when you look at probability statistics, the 100-year flood, we have an 18% chance of two 100-year floods occurring within that time period. So statistics can be funny how we look at them, but just because the numbers seem small doesn't mean that we're safe.
So when we're talking about a 1 in 10,000 chance, what time period are we talking about? We're saying that some event may occur and the chance is 1 out of 10,000. Is that per year? Is that per decade? When does the clock reset?
Yeah, it's a 1 in 10,000 chance every year. And these plants, of course, run for 60 years. So the probability of the event occurring sometime during the 60 years is a lot higher than 1 in 10,000.
The new chairperson for the NRC, Allison McFarland, a geologist, realizes that the industry's evaluation of earthquake vulnerability is inadequate. So I think that the NRC is waking up to this problem, but it's going to be an interesting argument as to what we do about it.
So let's go to Arnie. Arnie, what is your number one criticism of the NRC and their planning for earthquakes?
It's basically boils down to the secret is in the assumptions. And I've said that before in a number of matters. What do they assume is the worst earthquake that can happen? if we look at the Virginia earthquake, for instance, the plant was built for a 6 and it withstood a 5.8, and everybody's happy about that. As an engineer, it survived what it was designed to survive. That proves nothing. The bigger question is, if it had a 5.8, that tells me that there's a chance it could have a 6.5 in its lifetime. Low probability, high consequence. So I don't think the NRC is looking at these low probability, high consequence events, whether it be tsunami risks or earthquake risk or storm surges from severe Atlantic hurricanes. Their blinders are on. As humans, we have a hard time thinking about what's the worst thing that can happen beyond about a 10-year horizon. And the NRC is in that trap as well.
So we've been receiving a lot of emails about fracking or hydrofracking and questions about whether or not that could be connected to earthquakes. If fracking can cause earthquakes, which I don't know, do we have to be careful about doing it around nuclear power plants? Les?
Fracking, also known as hydraulic fracturing, does cause earthquakes. It's used by industry to increase the porosity and permeability of tight formations so we can extract the resources. It's been used also to dispose of toxic liquid waste that we bury, that we drill deep into the earth, and we pump the fluids down there to get rid of it. We know that also causes earthquakes. It's been a recent paper published in the journal Geology just last month looked at a link between wastewater injection and earthquakes. Indeed, it produced a 5.7 earthquake from wastewater injection. So hydrofracking does cause seismic events. The issue with drilling is we can use directional drilling. So we might go down several hundred meters and then go laterally for several kilometers. And therefore, just because the wellhead is at some distance from in this case, we're concerned about nuclear power plants, it could be that the earthquakes could occur closer to the power plant depending on where the liquids are. These liquids are not just water that we're putting down there, but there are a number of chemicals and also sand is added to keep these fractures open. So certainly, fracking causes earthquakes. We are aware of that. We've known this for many years.
Well, we've got the history on that recently is in Ohio has had a whole series of fracking-induced earthquakes in the Richter 3 to Richter 4 range. But there was one in Nebraska at 5.7. So a 5.7 is awfully similar to that 5.8 in Virginia.
That one, Arnie, was not fracking in the sense of extraction of fuels, which is why fracking is so common now in this country. That was a wastewater injection well that produced a 5.7 out there. It's a little bit different. It's the same idea in the sense that the one in Oklahoma is a 5.7, is wastewater injection. I guess the only difference is the purpose of pumping fluids into the ground. Are we pumping the fluids in the ground because they're too toxic to have near the surface? Are we pumping fluids in the ground to fracture the rock in order to extract some resources? So in either case, high pressure injection of fluids and chemicals will cause earthquakes.
So we've been talking about earthquake risk around nuclear plants and how to protect the reactor and the building and whatnot. But what about earthquake risk around spent fuel storage? How do we store the old fuel? We're talking about a nuclear power plant which may run from 40 to 60 years, but of course the spent fuel will need to be stored and protected for much longer. What is the earthquake risk when it comes to storing spent fuel?
The fact that the spent fuel will be in a given area for long periods of time, tens of thousands of years, makes it more likely that a seismic event will occur in that area. We can't build a building that lasts reliably for 100 years, let alone tens of thousands of years. So the issue of the storage of nuclear waste is an ongoing problem that nowhere in the world have we solved.
That's where Dr. McFarland's expertise really comes in with the NRC. She's been pretty clear that the choice of Yucca Mountain from a seismic standpoint was a really bad choice. And hopefully, Dr. McFarland will push the agency to consider more stable areas. That's our problem, the United States waste. But here's Japan with 50 plants, half the number the United States has, in the most seismically active piece of real estate on the planet. And the Japanese seem to think they can develop a waste disposal site, yet they haven't even begun the process yet. It concerns me that they continue to generate enormous amount of waste, and they haven't, A, found a site, and B, recognize that maybe you'll have to ship it to Mongolia or something like that, because on the island of Japan, there's essentially no piece of real estate that's not seismically active.
The chairwoman, Dr. McFarland of the NRC, believes, she's on record saying that she believes that a permanent repository can be set up eventually. I'm not so sure about that. I know that Finland's working on a project, but the issue of nuclear waste storage and safety, we could talk about this for several hours.
Well, I'm sure we'll have you back on the show in the near future to do that. Dr. Leslie Kanat, thanks for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
And Arnie, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Les.
Well, that does it for this week's edition of the Energy Education Podcast. You can catch us back here next week and every week for more on what's happening in the world of nuclear news and for more technical discussion. Also, don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. For Fairewinds Energy Education, I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.